Okay, so the UN agencies, along with many collaborators across the world, put out this report every year called the Adaptation Gap Report, and each time they have a kind of a rubric, a caption that tries to capture the mood of that year or indicate the performance of the past year. So this just came out, Adaptation Gap Report 2024. Come hell and high water, as fires and floods hit the poor hardest, it's time for the world to step up adaptation actions. 2023 report was called Underfinanced and Underprepared, and talked about how inadequately prepared we were and how the finance was not sufficient. The story is similar now, but some additional details. Adaptation is good to track every year. Mitigation has a clear metric. We are watching the emissions curves, and we have already talked about how all these mitigation efforts are not bending the curve yet. Adaptation is very local, and there is not always a clear index to track everything. In some sense, you want to reduce risks and reduce vulnerabilities, exposure, etc., and they depend on sector, agriculture, transportation, infrastructure, energy, water, etc. We'll look at some details, but essentially it's a much harder problem, and yet it's very urgent because all the impacts are already here, and the poor are paying a high price for the climate change that's been brought upon us by the rich countries. So it has a glossary of terms. I'll just pick one. Loss and damage is being discussed more and more. What is it? There is no agreed definition for loss and damage. IPCC 2022 that just got released recently distinguishes between loss and damage, the title case, which is used to refer to political debate under the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and losses and damages sentence case, so title case and sentence case, which is used to refer broadly to harm from observed impacts and projected risks, and can be economic or non-economic. So loss and damage is titular, and losses and damages are more of what is actually happening. In practice, loss and damage is most commonly understood as the adverse effects of climate change that are not or cannot be avoided by mitigation and adaptation efforts. Sometimes they are referred to as residual risks. After all you have done, you still have some risks. That risk is never zero, and there are really no risk-free options at this point. So we'll just run through the executive summary and look at some additional results from the chapters. It's a nice long report with incredible details, and I'm obviously going to be skipping most of those details to give you just the main points. As climate impacts intensify, adaptation action continues to fall behind needs. The 29th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or COP29, in Baku, provides an important opportunity to alter this trajectory and do better in terms of closing the adaptation gaps. There is always some good news. Progress in adaptation planning, implementation, and finance offer us some numbers on how countries are doing. The quality of adaptation planning is improving, but reaching global coverage of national adaptation planning instrument will be difficult. We'll look at the numbers. Here is a graph that we'll look at soon. Progress in adaptation implementation is slow and marred with problems. Countries need to ramp up their ambitions to prepare for increasing climate risks that are already here, and increasing means they are just waiting around the corner each year, each season. In fact, publication of national policy instruments for adaptation over time. These are the countries' position on the Fragile States Index. So there are countries that are not in the index too, outside the top 50 and top 40, and here are the rest of them. So top 3 not in progress, so you can split these into status of first planning instruments, not in progress, and in progress. There are various detail here looking at number of country parties. So conference of parties or countries that are participating in the entire process. And here, number of planning instruments published each year. It's not a uniform increase in the number of planning instruments, but nonetheless, number of adaptation planning instruments in place, these curves have at least one, at least two, and at least three. So you can see that many have at least one, but the number of new adaptation planning instruments published per year have been up or down. So we have not covered the complete list of countries in terms of submitting or preparing or showing an interest in, and so on and so forth. Progress in adaptation projects supported by financial mechanisms serving the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. We have discussed these Paris Agreement and others elsewhere, CIMIP 6, IPCC 2022, etc. So number of projects here, and they include the range of finances 0.5 to 10 million US dollars, 10 to 25 million, 25 to 50, and greater than 50 million. Total values of the projects per year, there's been ups and downs, but basically compared to 2007 we are up, but there's been a dip in 2023 and we are back up in 2024, and the investment until August 2024 is already showing signs of recovery. So they this didn't cover all of 2024, because when the report gets prepared, it's still year is still underway. Okay, so you get the sense that we are making progress, but it's not a very steady progress. The adaptation finance gap remains extremely large, and bridging this gap is priority for the NCQG for climate finance. So I already, this report has like 1,000 acronyms, and I remembered what NCQG was, and now I conveniently forgot it. Something NCQG. So new collective quantified goal. Why would I remember that? Anyway, second executive summary point: bridging the adaptation finance gap. I'm just showing some numbers here. Meeting the climate challenge will require a scaling up of adaptation finance, but also a more strategic approach to investment. We have discussed this elsewhere about conflating development projects with adaptation project, and funding also coming from external sources, maybe development banks or external foundations, guarantees, loans, etc., that are basically not separating development projects from adaptation projects, and not all development projects are helping adaptation. Sometimes development projects can in fact be maladaptation, because if you increase the road network to improve economic activities, then you may be just exposing yourself to more climate extremes and so on. Only around 1/3 of the adaptation finance gap is in areas typically financed by the private sector, but there is still a large opportunity for private sector investments. Enabling factors are key for unlocking adaptation finance, especially for the private sector. So we'll see what we mean by enabling factors a little bit later on. Comparison of adaptation financing needs, modeled costs, and international public adaptation finance flows in developing countries. I won't go into the details, but obviously when you model these things, for adaptation you need very local risk information, which is a combination of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure, and we don't have very reliable information at local scales, and yet we are estimating adaptation finance needs. So obviously there are lots of assumptions involved, so we have to be careful about that. US $1 billion per year for developing countries here. Finance needs, so adaptation financing needs for nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, 387 billion per year up to 2030. $387 billion per year. Modeled costs of adaptation, $215 per billion per year, $215 billion per year this decade. And the impact of achieving Glasgow Climate Pact finance goals here, international public finance, each COP makes some progress on loss and damage, climate finance, climate funds, to have a corpus of maybe 300 billion by 300 billion per year by 2035. I think some such number exists. Okay, so close the adaptation finance gap here, and achieving Glasgow Climate Pact's goal of doubling adaptation finance against 2019 levels would only slightly close the adaptation finance gap. So we get some agreement at COPs, and then we say at least we got an agreement, but it's not enough. So this is a weird game. Adaptation finance gap using model costs as a reference, and then adaptation finance gap using finance needs as a reference. So finance gaps and finance needs are used as references for estimating finance needs and modeling costs of adaptation. Okay, the question of who ultimately pays for adaptation is not being adequately addressed in the current discussion on adaptation financing. So even after you identify needs and model the costs, who's going to fund it? That's not so clear always. So here adaptation types and ease of financing to better elucidate the opportunities for private sector engagement. Obviously a busy diagram, but we'll just read some things to get an idea. Adaptation considerations. What are the considerations for potential for financing? Timing of the benefits. Longer the time it takes, higher the discount, so loss of your investment value. Level of uncertainty and complexity of action. Here monetization of benefits, complexity of project, transferability and replicability. So here there are some types of options: immediate, lower, and types of options go this way. And timing of benefits immediate, level of uncertainty lower, complexity of action lower, monetization of benefits easier, complexity of project. So these are the kind of financing considerations here and adaptation considerations there. So finance, whoever is financing, they are going to look for some sort of a cost benefit analysis in terms of timing of benefits or the uncertainty involved in the finance, the project that is getting financed, and so on. So timing of action again here, reactive, so in response to changes experienced already. Anticipatory, so in anticipation of protected changes to come, projected changes. My eyes are going bad. So it's whether it's incremental in the nature of adaptation, whether it's incremental or transformational. We have discussed these terminologies elsewhere. Intent of action is responsive and it's planned as well as systemic and not just ad hoc. Type of option can be no or low regret. So depends. So then financing can be easier, but as you go this way, it becomes more difficult. So timing of benefits can be immediate or longer term. Level of uncertainty can be lower or higher, and complexity of action can be lower or higher. Similarly here, easier to harder, lower to higher, lower to easier to harder. So obviously financing becomes more difficult. If it is no or low regret, financing will be easier. Climate proofing, adaptive management, and transformative change. Okay, so you get the idea that there is a matrix which is kind of selected to attract potential for finance, private financing, and you also have investment sizes involved, market sectors, non-market sectors, public goods, whether you are trying to protect economic activities, in which case a country that's trying to sell you something may fund your adaptation so that your purchasing power remains high against climate risks, or it could be public goods, like you are trying to protect a forest in a country, or some kind of a biodiversity and other resources or public goods, commons, right? Thirdly, enhancing capacity building and technology transfer to improve the effectiveness of adaptive actions. Capacity capacity building and technology transfer are central to enhancing adaptation action in developing countries, but there is uncertainty regarding their effectiveness in terms of how well that gets used to actually achieve adaptation, but adaptation really in terms of reducing vulnerability and risks. Developing countries express needs for more capacity and technology across all aspects of adaptation planning and implementation, with a focus on water, food and agriculture. They tend to be top priorities because they are not really big on economic growth. They are just trying to survive. Bridging the gap between capacity and technology needs and levels of action on the ground requires overcoming multifaceted challenges. We'll look at some of the barriers a little bit later on. But capacity building and technology transfer could accelerate adaptation planning and implementation. Some people argue that adaptation is not so much about specific action, but actually capacity building, so that the society, community, nation, states, they learn to adapt to extremes, increasing risks, sea level rise, cyclones, whatever it is, so that you teach them how to deal with the climate risks rather than giving specific structures like building a bridge or seawall or renewable energy farm or so on and so forth. Okay, who ultimately pays for adaptation in least developed countries? So highly concessional in this direction in terms of level of concessionality, and low concessionality as you go this way. So in terms of financial flows, bilateral and multilateral philanthropic organizations make a high concession. Similarly, international public grants, climate fund grant, government and NGOs, and public benefit. So here the recipient or intermediary is a government or an NGO, and the beneficiaries are society and citizens in general. Similarly, as you go towards the mid-level, you have international finance institutions, concessional finance or loan for on lending, and the recipients are development banks, so there is a repayment of loan involved, and beneficiaries are society and citizens, and repayment of loans in some ways is also passed on to the society as taxes and so on. Okay, so here I won't read more, but obviously there are instruments, financial markets, etc., that provide non-concessional loans or bonds, and again governments and public finances receive the loans, and society and citizens benefit again. In all cases, society and citizens are supposed to benefit, but there is sometimes repayment of loans involved. Okay, as adaptation targets processes and enabling factors, this is a framework. So you have the enabling factors which have to make it possible for iterative adaptation policy cycles to work, and then you have the UAE, United Arab Emirates framework for global climate resilience thematic areas, and those are health, infrastructure and settlements, cultural heritage, poverty and livelihoods, ecosystems and biodiversity, food and agriculture and water. In terms of enabling factors, you have data, knowledge and communications, educational capacity building infrastructure, institutions and institutional arrangements, financing, engagement and leadership. And here in iterative adaptation policy, you have impact, vulnerability and risk assessments which are needed in terms of monitoring and verifying progress in terms of adaptation, and you have here planning involved as well as implementation, effective and efficient, and here monitoring, evaluation and learning. So it's adaptive learning as well. All of these feed into the thematic areas, iterative adaptation policy cycle and enabling factors, which include health, so risk assessment and monitoring, awareness and communication, ecosystem and biodiversity, infrastructure and settlements, food and agriculture, cultural heritage, water, poverty and livelihood. So in water you have risk assessment and monitoring, community engagement and regulations. We looked at ways to pay for water or put tariffs on water to manage water more sustainably and provide resilience to water resource systems. Iterative adaptation, we already talked about impact, vulnerability and risk assessment, planning, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Enabling factors, also we mentioned all the things: engagement, leadership, financing, etc. And they are not trivial. They have to be followed through, and it's not just reports that sit on shelves, because when implementation is involved, you have to have actual metrics to measure success. As we said, it's not as easy as mitigation, but yet you have to somehow ensure that there is no maladaptation, there is no waste of resources, that expertise exists and capacity building happens, and so on. Fourth in the executive summary is insights into aspects of the UAE framework for climate resilience, global climate resilience. Countries are making progress towards the targets of UAE FGCR, but increased efforts will be needed to reach them in time. So here is a graphic: percentage of national adaptation plans with adaptation priorities addressing the thematic and dimensional targets of UAE FGCR. So I won't read the percentage of national adaptation plans that actually do it, but we already saw that thematic targets are agriculture and food, ecosystem, biodiversity, water, infrastructure and settlements, health, poverty and livelihoods, and cultural heritage. It's good to read them again and again so that you get that into your head. And here dimensional targets along the thematic targets: impact, vulnerability and risk assessment, planning, implementation, monitoring, evaluation and learning. So this is also very pedagogical in that sense. If you are learning about adaptation, you have to remember these sorts of things, because you may not be working on adaptation in all of them, but you may be just focused on agriculture, food, maybe developing early warning systems, helping optimize irrigation and so on. Operational landscape of the international climate negotiations framed by the Global Goal on Climate Adaptation GGA and Global Stocktake aims are: assess progress on adaptation globally, accelerate action and support, especially to developing countries. So UAE framework for global climate resilience approached through 7 globally relevant thematic targets. We already mentioned them: water, food, agriculture, health, etc. and 4 dimensional targets, which also we mentioned in terms of vulnerability, risk, impacts, planning, implementation, and new collective quantified goal, NCQG, floor of $100 billion per year, US billion dollar per year, building on needs of developed countries. So that's kind of where you want in terms of financial flows that we talked about. And every time you talk about adaptation gaps, biggest part is going to be about financial flow gaps, as opposed to also planning, implementing and tracking actual impacts of adaptation. Newly established fund for responding to loss and damage. Well, it's been agreed upon, but whether funds will actually be there is yet to be seen, at least in terms of the levels of 300 billion per year out to 2030 and so on. Overview of, I think it reaches $1 trillion by 2035. We talked about this elsewhere. I don't remember the exact number, but they are massive. Overview of criteria used to assess potential effectiveness of adaptation planning and its associated indicators. I won't read all the details, but criteria and rationale and indicators. Robustness of evidence base, indicators related to climate projections, indicators related to IVR information. I again forgot IVR. I'm getting old. I should write them down, but I always think I'm going to remember. I obviously remember some of them, but there are so many that I tend to... Okay, impacts, vulnerability and risks. That's a fairly straightforward one. I don't know why I forgot that one, but happens. Sorry about that. IVR is impacts, vulnerability and risks. Vulnerabilities and risks. So we have to track IVRs to make sure that NAPs are considering them, that there are metrics to look at them, and whether transboundary risks and cascading impacts are also looked at. Also, we have to look at coverage, so that The priority measures for reducing vulnerability and building resilience cover a range of sectors and or systems in the country, which UAE I keep jumping back and forth. So UAE FGCR thematic targets we already looked at, FGCR dimensional targets we already looked at, which enabling factors are addressed by adaptation priorities in NAP. Is it leadership, financing, institutional arrangements, engagement, data research, knowledge and communications, skills and capacities, and so on. Implementability, of course, is another criteria and rationale, and indicators there, elements that facilitate implementation, such as are the costs of adaptation actions included in the plans, are financing sources identified, or is it just an idealized plan with no reality checks, alignment with domestic and global policy agendas, elements that facilitate MEL, monitoring, evaluation and learning framework. Everybody has to learn so that the lessons are transferred, plus sustainability and adaptation and resilience are such that they are very local, and yet they have to adapt to the global resilience, global sustainability and global adaptation, because the system as a whole is only as resilient or as sustainable as each individual element, component, state, community and so on. Inclusiveness, so gender and equity, justice, etc., which are always important. I won't show the percentages, but this is basically about percentage of national adaptation plans with adaptation priorities addressing the thematic and dimensional targets of UAE FGCR and the 6 enabling factors for effective NAP processes. So all the NAPs are being looked at for thematic targets, whether they are addressed or not, dimensional targets and enabling factors. We know what they are already, we read them a couple of times, but here is a distribution of countries across the NAP NDC alignment continuum. So countries are submitting the nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. They are being updated. They also have monitoring, reporting, evaluation in terms of reducing emissions and meeting SDGs and various other things. And then there is national adaptation plan that is being submitted by the countries. How synergistic are they with each other? Okay, so there are 16% of the countries where there is no alignment between NAP and NDC. Some 68% of the countries have a partial alignment, and only 16% have full alignment between NAP and NDC. Obviously, to be very effective and efficient with financing, planning, implementing, capacity building, you have to have them both to be very synergistic with each other. The 5 main areas, main criteria used for in final evaluations of the NAPs: outcomes, effectiveness, efficiency, relevance, and sustainability. Okay, so 6-point rating scale: highly satisfactory, satisfactory, moderately satisfactory, moderately unsatisfactory, unsatisfactory, and highly unsatisfactory. 4-point rating scale: likely, moderately likely, moderately unlikely, and unlikely for the sustainability. Okay, these are for outcomes, effectiveness, efficiency, and relevance. So here are some numbers then. Barriers and challenges to NAP implementation as mentioned in NAP progress reports. So barriers and challenger category: institutional barriers, informational deficiencies or lack of information, financial barriers and challenges, human capacity lacking, social barriers, organizational barriers, and emerging issues such as COVID-19. And these are the percentage of NAP progress reports that include this. Institutional barriers and challenges top the list at over 40%, and then come information problems at 37%, and so on. Okay, but just gives you a range of evaluations that are happening. It's not just that you submit an NAP and then you are done. You have to implement it and keep reporting why progress is not being made, what are the challenges, what are the barriers, and so on. Distribution of self-reporting cities and number of adaptation actions reported per city. Well, of course, the Western world is there, Europe and US and Canada, but you also have South America, Africa, and Asia. They're all doing well. Of course, Japan is there and Australia is there, the global north. But here you can see that the size of the circles are the adaptation actions. We'll also see whether the adaptation actions are technological or what kind of sector they are in, and so on, in a minute. But this is just for the cities, not for the national adaptation plans. There is a separate C40 kind of activity, a lot of bottom-up networks that try to you create a club, so that being a member of the club gives you a motivation to do well and be ranked for your actions and successes, right? Frequency of self-reported types of adaptation actions and hazards addressed by adaptation actions, as well as adaptation co-benefits and their distributions per United Nations region. I won't read all the details of the number of actions, but the regions are Western European and other states, Eastern European states, Latin American and Caribbean states, Asia Pacific states, and African states. Here you have engineering and technological actions, adaptation actions, nature-based solutions, behavioral and educational actions, economic actions, governance and legislative, and other actions which are not identified specifically. Hazards addressed by adaptation actions reported by cities. Heat related hazards, so these are still from those regions. Heat related hazards, flooding, droughts, coastal hazards, fire, erosion, landslide and mass movement, health and vector-borne diseases, cold related hazards, ecological degradation, storms besides coastal and others. So this gives you a sense of just how complicated adaptation is and how location specific it is, so that tracking it is much more challenging than mitigation, which is just tracking global level greenhouse gases and their increase or reduction, rates of increase, and so on. Cited co-benefits of the adaptation actions reported by cities: economy, social security, co-benefits, social security and services, ecosystem services, energy and infrastructure, health, and greenhouse gas mitigation. So adaptation actions obviously have some mitigation benefits as well. Climate finance commitments, I won't go into the details, but you can see that in terms of adaptation, mitigation and cross-cutting, there seems to be an increase in funding, with mitigation taking up most of it, because this is again easily coordinated globally, global leadership emerges. But when you want to think about adaptation, even though it's increasing overall from Annex 2 to non-Annex 1 countries, we are still got a big financial need gap that we mentioned. I'm not mentioning those numbers here, but percentage of NAPs submitted to UNFCCC that propose specific categories of capacity building interventions. As I said, adaptation is not just about implementing projects, but also building capacities, so that individuals, firms, and communities are capable of dealing with evolving risks, because risks are constantly evolving now. So despite the uncertainties, ambiguities, and complexities, capacity has to be developed to deal with the risks. Percentage of NAPs, training workshops and programs, educational programming, knowledge exchange, institutional strengthening, public outreach and awareness. Okay, so I ran through it. It's a long report, but I have given you the most important points. If you want the details, you obviously want to go back and look at the report, which is freely available, but this should be useful. At least I find it very useful to look at these reports every year and try to understand where everybody is headed, especially the developing countries, especially India, because that's where I live now. Okay, see you in the next topic.